The grand estate stood like a sleeping giant on the edge of the city, its windows gleaming under a pale morning sun that could never quite touch its heart. Everything inside the Hawthorne mansion was beautiful, but distant, like a painting behind glass. The marble floors reflected a world of quiet perfection, yet no laughter echoed through its halls. It was a place that smelled faintly of dust, flowers that never wilted, and memories too heavy to move. And somewhere within its stillness, a man watched his kingdom with eyes that no longer trusted anyone to stay. Liam Hawthorne didn't believe in peace anymore. His life was an orchestra of deals, meetings, and immaculate facades, a symphony of control that left no room for warmth. His voice could silence a room. His name could open any door. Yet beneath that polished composure lived a man haunted by the smallest act of betrayal, one that taught him never to mistake kindness for truth. And so he surrounded himself with glass walls, elegant silence, and people who only spoke when he needed them to. But that morning, the rhythm of his routine faltered. A faint sound, soft and rhythmic, broke the mansion's silence, the whisper of cloth against wood, the melody of effort that didn't demand attention. Down in the foyer, sunlight spilled through the high windows, painting gold across the staircase. There, crouched by the banister, was a girl whose presence barely made a sound. Her name was Sophie Whitmore, and she moved as if the world might break if she disturbed it too loudly. Her braid shimmered in the light, a single thread of gold in the grey hush of the house. She wore a simple dress, worn at the hem, an apron tied with a bow that looked too neat to be accidental. Her hands, small and sure, worked in gentle rhythm. She didn't hum. She didn't sigh. She simply worked, as though every movement was a prayer for stillness. She had been here almost a month, long enough for others to whisper, "The new maid doesn't take tips," someone said. "She never rests, never complains." They said it like a puzzle, as if honesty required explanation. But Sophie didn't hear them. She woke before dawn, cleaned rooms no one entered anymore, and moved like she was part of the air itself, present but unseen. Liam had noticed her before, in passing, an unfamiliar figure in a world where everything was accounted for. Yet there was something about her that unsettled him. It wasn't her quietness or her diligence, but the way she seemed untouched by the small, invisible greed that lived in most people. She worked like someone grateful for the chance to exist at all. From his study on the top floor, Liam stood before a wall of glowing screens. The estate's security feeds flickered softly, each showing the pristine calm of a house too clean to feel lived in. But his gaze stayed on one square, the dining room, where Sophie polished the table until the sunlight shimmered back like liquid gold. "She doesn't take tips," he murmured, his tone neither admiration nor suspicion. Something colder. Daniel, his assistant, looked up from his tablet. "No, sir. She's decent. Everyone says so." "Decent," Liam repeated, almost to himself. "Or clever." He turned away from the monitors, toward the window that overlooked the gardens. Beyond the glass, roses bloomed in perfect lines, his mother's favorite flowers, kept alive by money, not love. "My father used to say," Liam whispered, "people who look too humble are the ones who hide the sharpest knives." He didn't realize he was still watching her reflection in the glass, how she paused to straighten a chair already perfect, how she smiled softly to herself when no one was around. That smile, uncalculated, unused to being seen. Something in it stirred the dust around his heart. He clenched his jaw as though to silence the thought before it could grow, but it grew anyway. That evening he walked through the halls long after the staff had gone to their quarters. His footsteps echoed softly on the marble floors. In the reflection of the glass doors he saw his own silhouette. A man too used to winning, too afraid of losing. The memory of her voice lingered from earlier that day. Just a whisper. "Thank you, Mr. Hawthorne," when he'd passed by her in the corridor. So simple, yet it had sounded like something he'd forgotten existed. When had gratitude stopped feeling real to him? He didn't know. But now, as he entered the living room, he found himself pausing. The scent of lavender lingered faintly in the air. On the table sat a small crystal vase filled with fresh-cut flowers, wild ones from the garden, not the imported arrangements the florist sent every week. Someone had placed them there deliberately, quietly, like a secret offering to soften the cold. And for some reason, he knew it was her. He stood there longer than he should have, staring at the flowers as if they held an answer he didn't have the courage to ask for. Maybe, he thought, she was too good to be real. Maybe she was pretending, like everyone else. Maybe her kindness was just another disguise. He didn't want to believe that, but belief wasn't a luxury for men like him. In a world built on deception, sincerity looked like a trick. That night, as rain touched the windows, Liam sat in the glow of his monitors again, the screens reflecting in his tired eyes. Sophie appeared once more, her figure small and calm in the endless brightness of the room. He zoomed in. She was polishing the edge of the window pane, tracing the glass with careful precision. There was no one watching, no one to impress. Still, she smiled faintly, as though the act itself gave her peace. He frowned, torn between curiosity and something dangerously close to admiration. "Too perfect," he whispered. "Too careful." A thought formed. A quiet, dangerous one. If she was real, he needed to know. If she was pretending, he would find out. And so, Liam Hawthorne, the man who trusted nothing but proof, began planning his test. He would leave temptation in plain sight. He would watch without being seen. He would uncover the truth behind the girl with the golden braid and the eyes that never met his for too long. But beneath his logic, something else stirred. A pulse of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope, fragile and unwanted, like a seed forcing its way through stone. The next morning, the estate glowed with quiet purpose. Sophie moved through the rooms with her usual grace, unaware that her every step was soon to become part of an unseen game. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. The grand piano gleamed in the corner, the silverware shone like mirrors, and the man upstairs waited, half curious, half afraid, for a truth that might change him. Because sometimes healing doesn't arrive gently. It slips in through suspicion, through the tiny cracks we never meant to open. And as the clock struck noon, Liam's plan began to unfold, the test that would decide whether kindness still existed in his world, or if it had long since died with his faith in people. In another corner of the house, unaware of the watchful eyes above, Sophie paused for a moment by the window. She pressed her hand lightly against the glass and smiled at the morning light. It wasn't the smile of someone trying to be seen. It was the smile of someone remembering that even after long nights, the sun still returns. If only he could see that smile for what it was, not a secret, not a performance, but a soft proof that love still breathes quietly, even in the loneliest rooms. And maybe, just maybe, if you've ever felt the same stillness, the same ache between trust and doubt, this story might remind you that the gentlest souls can heal even the hardest hearts. If it touches something inside you, leave a little warmth below. Share a word, a thought, a spark of kindness, because in the end, every small light helps another find its way home. Like, comment, or subscribe. Not for algorithms, but for the stories that keep us believing that somewhere behind the coldest walls, love is still waiting to be found. The test was about to begin, and neither of them knew. It wasn't just about trust. It was about redemption. About how two broken souls could meet in the quiet and find healing where no one expected it. The story was only beginning. The afternoon light slid gently through the curtains of the Hawthorne estate, painting slow golden waves across the floor. Dust motes floated like memories in the still air. The silence felt alive, expectant, like the house itself knew something was about to be tested. On the velvet sofa near the tall windows, Liam Hawthorne sat perfectly still, his shirt crisp, his posture deliberate, his expression unreadable. The faint hum of the grandfather clock counted down the seconds of his plan. The living room had been staged to perfection. A wallet, a Philippe watch, and a neat stack of $100 bills arranged casually on the oak table as if forgotten in haste. Every angle had been checked, every camera lens hidden behind art and glass. It wasn't a trap meant to humiliate. It was an experiment born of suspicion and fear, crafted by a man who had forgotten what uncalculated goodness looked like. He closed his eyes slowly, letting his breath even out, rehearsing the rhythm of sleep. Liam wasn't testing her honesty as much as he was testing the possibility that someone might still be real. Somewhere in the deepest chamber of his guarded heart, he wanted her to pass, but wanting something that pure terrified him. Footsteps approached, soft, barely audible, the sound of slippers brushing marble, the faint creak of the doorway. Sophie. She paused at the threshold, her figure outlined by the gentle sunlight. Her dress was pale grey, her apron freshly pressed. A few strands of her hair had escaped the neat braid, falling like threads of light along her face. She carried a small basket of cleaning cloths, the scent of lemon and soap following her like a whisper. Liam kept his eyes closed, his body utterly still. Sophie's gaze swept the room, instinctively catching every imperfection, the slightly tilted frame on the wall, the misplaced cushion, the faint fingerprint on the glass table. Then her eyes landed on the table near him, the wallet, the money, the watch, temptation laid bare. The air shifted almost imperceptibly. She inhaled, quiet and hesitant. Then she stepped closer, her steps feather-light on the rug. The quiet thud of her heartbeat seemed to echo louder than her footsteps. She stopped by the table. Her reflection shone faintly in the polished surface as she looked at the stack of bills, then at him, his still form, his hand resting open, the cufflink glinting softly. Her gaze lingered, but not with greed. It was curiosity, mixed with something gentler. Concern, maybe. She reached out, not toward the money, but toward the corner of the table, running her cloth across it in slow, circular motions. The scent of lemon oil filled the air. She adjusted the placement of a vase, moved a coaster, and finally, without a word, picked up a hardcover book from the nearby shelf. A book he hadn't touched in years. Its spine was cracked with time. She placed it gently over the money, as if protecting something that should not tempt anyone who passed by. Then she stepped back, her fingers brushing the edge of the book, her face soft with unspoken thought. Liam's pulse beat hard in his chest. Every part of him wanted to open his eyes, to ask her why, to break the silence, but he didn't. He stayed frozen, pretending sleep, though something deeper than curiosity was waking inside him. Sophie turned toward him. The light touched her face as she looked down at him, a man who seemed too powerful to ever need comfort, and yet, in that moment, looked unbearably human. She hesitated only a breath before picking up the folded throw blanket from the nearby chair. The fabric unfurled slowly in her hands, and she draped it over him with care, the movement tender and reverent. Her fingers brushed the edge of his hair, fixing a stray lock from his forehead. It was a touch so delicate, so filled with quiet sincerity, that it undid something he had spent years building. And then she whispered, barely audible, but he heard every word. "Thank you for giving me this job. I won't let you down." The words landed like a prayer, soft and trembling, and then she was gone. Her footsteps faded down the hallway until only the hum of silence remained. Liam lay there, eyes still closed, but every part of him awake, his heart, his doubts, his buried longing. He waited another minute before opening his eyes. The blanket rested over him, warm from her hands. The book still lay across the table, its faded cover shielding the money from view. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the cold weight of loneliness pressing against his ribs. Instead, he felt something new, fragile as morning light. He sat up slowly, staring at the table. The book's title was almost rubbed away, but he could still make it out. The Measure of Faith. He laughed under his breath, a sound that didn't quite reach his eyes. "How ironic," he murmured. Later that evening, when the house was quiet and the moon spread pale silver through the windows, Liam replayed the footage in his office. The camera had caught every moment, the hesitation, the book, the blanket, the whisper. He watched it once, then again, slower this time, noticing details he hadn't before. The way she smoothed the corner of the blanket, the fleeting sadness in her eyes before she turned away. There was no performance in her gestures, no greed, no calculation, just grace. For a long time he sat there in the blue glow of the screen, unable to look away. Each frame seemed to carve new cracks in the walls around his heart. He wasn't sure what to call the feeling that rose inside him. Gratitude? Guilt? Wonder? It didn't matter. It was real, and that alone terrified him. The next morning he saw her in the kitchen. She stood at the counter, wiping a tray clean, her hair loose this time, a small strand tucked behind her ear. The window light touched her skin with the warmth of dawn. She didn't see him watching from the doorway. She moved quietly, humming under her breath, the sound soft and healing in its simplicity. For a man who had spent years surrounded by noise, that small sound felt like a lullaby. He turned away before she could see him, but something had shifted. The test he'd designed to expose her had instead exposed him to the emptiness of his own life, to the tenderness he'd long buried beneath control. and that realization frightened him more than any betrayal ever had. That night he stood again in the living room where it had all happened. The room looked unchanged, perfectly arranged, untroubled. Yet something invisible lingered there. The ghost of her voice, the weight of her kindness. He sat on the same sofa, staring at the spot where she'd stood. The world outside was quiet. Rain tapped gently against the windows, the kind of rain that heals instead of breaks. He thought of the way her hand had brushed his hair. No one had touched him like that in years, not since his mother, long before he'd learned to fear affection. He exhaled, closing his eyes, letting the sound of the rain seep into him. For once, the silence didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like peace. In the days that followed, he began to notice things he'd overlooked before. A teacup set slightly off-center, but always cleaned to perfection, the faint trace of lavender on his desk, left from where she had wiped it earlier. A folded note by the back door. Left extra fruit in the fridge for Mrs. Green. She's been craving peaches, signed only with a tiny, hand-drawn flower. Each gesture was a language he'd never learned to speak. Gentleness without agenda. Care without witness. It was healing in its quietest form. Daniel noticed the change first. Liam no longer barked orders. He paused before speaking, looked out the window more often. He seemed softer, though he'd never admit it. "Everything all right, sir?" Daniel asked one morning. Liam's answer came after a pause. "Yes," he said simply, eyes distant. "For once, I think it might be." He didn't understand why her presence, so humble and small, felt like light creeping through the cracks of a locked door. But every time she entered a room, the air seemed less heavy. He started wondering things he'd never wondered before. Did she hum to herself because she was happy, or because she had to drown out loneliness? Did she move so quietly because she feared being noticed, or because she didn't want to disturb peace? He didn't know, but he wanted to. The night before the estate's big luncheon, he lingered by his mother's portrait in the hallway. The artist had captured her in soft colors, eyes kind, expression serene. "You'd like her," he murmured to the painting. "She reminds me of you." He didn't notice that Sophie had entered the corridor until she stopped a few steps behind him. "Your mother?" she asked softly. He turned. "Yes," he said, surprised by how natural it felt to answer. "She used to fill this house with music. I didn't realize how much I missed the sound of it." Sophie smiled faintly. "Silence can be heavy when it has no kindness in it." He looked at her then, really looked. Her eyes were calm, but not empty. They held something rare, something steady. "You're not like anyone I've met before," he said before he could stop himself. Her cheeks flushed. "I just try to be good to the world that's been hard on me," she said quietly. "It's easier than staying angry." For a long moment, neither spoke. The air between them felt fragile, like the hush between notes in a song that isn't finished yet. He wanted to tell her that her words were the first healing thing he'd heard in years. Instead, he only nodded. "You've done more for this place than you realize," he said. "It feels alive again." She looked down, smiling shyly, and walked away, leaving the faint scent of lavender behind her. When she was gone, Liam whispered to the empty hall, "So do I." That night, as the wind brushed through the open balcony doors and the city lights flickered in the distance, He felt something inside him begin to soften completely, the first quiet bloom of hope in soil that had long been barren. And though he didn't know it yet, that fragile hope would be tested again. For healing rarely arrives without a storm. But for now, the house slept in peace. Sophie dreamed of sunlight, and Liam, for the first time in years, slept without the weight of suspicion pressing against his heart, wrapped not just in the blanket she'd laid over him, but in the warmth of something far more delicate, the beginning of trust. And somewhere between dream and waking, he found himself whispering words he didn't remember saying aloud, soft, unguarded, and full of meaning. "Thank you." Outside, the rain stopped. Morning waited beyond the horizon, patient and full of light. The sun rose like a quiet promise over the Hawthorne estate, spilling a soft gold that melted the last traces of mist along the gardens. Inside, the mansion breathed a stillness that felt lighter than it used to, as if the air itself had been washed clean. Liam stood by the tall windows of his study, coffee untouched, eyes on the world outside. Sophie moved across the courtyard below, her figure small but steady, folding linens that fluttered like pale wings in the breeze. He didn't know why he watched her every morning now, only that something about her rhythm calmed the parts of him he'd long thought were unfixable. The test had ended days ago, but its echo remained. He had meant to catch deceit, to confirm that his instincts were right, that goodness was always a mask. But instead, she had done the impossible. She had looked temptation in the eye and responded with tenderness. She had placed the book, covered the money, tucked a blanket over a man who didn't know how to be cared for. In her silence, she had spoken the one language he'd forgotten existed: trust without condition. He told no one about what happened. Daniel, ever observant, sensed something shifting in his employer, but didn't ask. The mansion staff whispered among themselves, noticing the smallest differences. Mr. Hawthorne's voice had softened. The kitchen seemed warmer when he passed through, and once, unbelievably, he had been seen smiling. Sophie, unaware of the quiet miracle she had caused, continued her work as always. She rose before sunrise, lit the lamps in the corridors, and polished every mirror until it reflected light instead of gloom. She still refused tips, still smiled with that shy, grateful curve of her lips. But now, every time she saw Liam in passing, she felt something strange, a warmth that fluttered like wings beneath her ribs. He had begun greeting her, not with the distant nod of a master to his staff, but with the soft acknowledgement of one human being seeing another. One morning, she found a small porcelain cup beside her cleaning supplies. Inside it was tea, perfectly brewed, no note, no name, but she knew. The gesture felt like sunlight breaking through cloud, a wordless kindness she had long forgotten how to receive. As the days passed, Liam started noticing everything. The way she hummed softly while dusting the old piano, a tune he almost recognized. The way her fingertips lingered on the edges of old photographs, as though she could feel the emotions trapped inside them. He found himself slowing down, watching her work from afar, trying to understand what gave her that quiet resilience. It wasn't fascination. It was healing. In her presence, the noise in his mind softened, the sharp edges of his thoughts dulled. He caught himself remembering things he had buried, the warmth of his mother's laughter echoing down these same halls, the scent of lavender in her hair, the way she once told him that kindness was never weakness, but a seed that bloomed in time. He wondered when he had stopped believing that. That afternoon, he passed by the kitchen and saw Sophie standing on her toes, reaching to place a jar on the high shelf. Without thinking, he stepped closer and took it from her hands, setting it in place with ease. She startled, turning to face him, her cheeks flushed. "Thank you, sir," she said softly. He almost said, "Call me Liam," but the words stayed caught in his throat. Instead, he simply nodded. "You're welcome." The moment was simple, brief, but something in the way their eyes met lingered long after they turned away. He carried that look with him through the rest of the day, the look of someone who expected nothing but gratitude, and yet gave more kindness than most who had everything. That night, he returned to the living room where it had all begun. The table stood empty now, the same table where he had once laid his test. He ran his fingers over the smooth surface, remembering the feel of the book, the whisper of her voice, the sound of her steps leaving the room. He exhaled deeply, letting the memory wash through him. He didn't want to analyze it anymore. He just wanted to feel it. The next morning, he noticed something small yet striking. A dusty photograph on the mantel, one he hadn't touched in years, was clean, its silver frame gleaming as though freshly polished. The woman in the picture, his mother, smiled back at him with the warmth of memory. Beneath the frame was a small folded note, "For the things that deserve to be remembered." No signature. Just a hand-drawn flower in the corner, the same one he'd seen on the fruit note in the kitchen. He stood there for a long time, fingers trembling slightly. Something inside him loosened. The ache of years began to ease. That evening he saw her again. The sun was setting, painting the corridors in a soft amber glow. Sophie knelt by the grand staircase, polishing the railing that curved like a river of light. The quiet devotion in her movement drew him closer. "You don't have to do that every day," he said gently. She looked up, startled. "It's part of my job." He leaned on the banister, watching her hands glide over the wood. "You take it too seriously." "I like when things shine," she said simply. "It makes people feel better when they pass by. Sometimes a clean place can heal a heavy heart." He blinked, caught off guard by the truth in her words. She wasn't speaking about the railing. She was speaking about the world, about broken people like him. "Does it heal yours?" he asked quietly. Her hands paused for a moment. "Some days, yes," she whispered, "and some days it just keeps me from falling apart." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was tender, fragile, filled with understanding. "Then keep doing it," he said finally, his voice lower. "Because it's working." She looked up at him again, her eyes glimmering like glass touched by candlelight. "Thank you, Mr. Hawthorne." He turned away before she could see the softness that crossed his face. That night, as he sat alone in his office, Liam replayed their words in his mind. For years, he had built his empire on logic and control. Yet a maid with tired hands had reminded him of something he had long forgotten: the quiet power of care. He began to wonder if healing wasn't about fixing what was broken, but about allowing light to reach the places you'd hidden for too long. The following week, an unexpected scene unfolded. Liam returned home late from a business dinner. As he passed by the garden windows, he noticed someone sitting outside on the stone bench, her figure faint beneath the silver wash of moonlight. Sophie. She sat with her arms wrapped around herself, her phone dim in her lap. Her shoulders trembled as if she were holding back tears. The sight of it stirred something sharp and protective in him. He hesitated at the door, unsure whether to interrupt. But when she pressed her sleeve to her face, trying to wipe her tears away, he felt his chest tighten painfully. He didn't step out. He couldn't. He didn't know how to comfort anyone anymore. He simply stood there in the shadow, watching as she whispered something he couldn't hear. After a while, she straightened her shoulders, inhaled deeply, and walked back inside, her steps steady though her eyes still glistened. When the door closed behind her, Liam remained there, the echo of her sadness haunting the air. He had built walls around his life to keep pain out, but seeing her, small and trembling under the night sky, made him realize that walls kept comfort out too. The next morning before dawn, he brewed tea himself, a clumsy attempt, but the scent was warm, inviting. He slipped a white envelope under her cup on the kitchen tray. Inside, a modest amount of money and a line written in his careful hand. "Do not refuse. It's your salary in advance." No signature. When she found it, she stood frozen for a moment. Then she touched the envelope as though it might vanish. She looked around the quiet kitchen, eyes misted, but said nothing. Liam watched from the shadows of the doorway. He didn't need to see her expression to know what she felt. He could feel it too. Gratitude. Relief. A small, unexpected healing blooming in the middle of their silence. It wasn't about the money. It was about being seen. In the days that followed, something subtle changed between them. When they crossed paths in the hall, their eyes met longer. When she placed his tea on the table, her hands trembled slightly, and he pretended not to notice. The air between them carried something fragile and new, something that felt like a beginning. Late one evening, as the last light faded beyond the tall windows, Liam sat at his desk, looking over the estate's financial reports. The numbers blurred. His thoughts drifted. He leaned back, exhaling softly. For the first time, the silence around him didn't feel empty. It felt alive, with her presence, with the faint scent of lavender she always left behind. He realized then that his test hadn't been about her at all. It had been about himself, about whether his heart was still capable of recognizing goodness when it stood right in front of him. And she had answered without knowing the question. The night deepened. Somewhere in the distance he heard her laughter, a quiet, fleeting sound as she helped the gardener carry tools inside before the rain. It was a sound that reached him in ways words never could, softening the last corner of his doubt. He turned toward the window and smiled to himself, a small, almost invisible smile. Healing had a sound, he realized. And tonight it sounded like her laughter floating through the rain. The wind shifted. The scent of wet earth filled the air. Outside, Sophie lifted her face toward the sky, letting the first drops fall across her cheeks, her eyes closed, peaceful. He didn't know it yet, but that was the moment something irreversible began. The kind of change that doesn't announce itself, but settles deep into the soul, like light sinking into water, finding the places that have long been dark. The days ahead would test them both. But for now, beneath the soft rain and the hush of evening, there was only quiet understanding. Two hearts learning without words, that even after betrayal, even after loneliness, trust can bloom again. And as the last light flickered out, Liam Hawthorne, the man who once believed love was a myth, felt his heart whisper the truth he could no longer deny. He was beginning to fall. The afternoon sun poured through the high windows, soft and golden, touching everything it found with a tender kind of warmth. The Hawthorne estate was alive that day, polished silver, quiet laughter from the kitchen, the faint hum of preparation for the luncheon that would gather the city's most refined faces. The staff moved with precision, every movement practiced, every word careful. Yet beneath the calm rhythm of work, a small current of unease stirred, invisible but real. Sophie had spent the morning arranging the long dining table, her fingers brushing along the linen with almost reverent care. She checked every fork, every folded napkin, every plate aligned in perfect harmony. It was the kind of work she loved, simple, structured, a quiet order that gave peace to her thoughts. She was content in her small world, one where kindness still mattered, and silence could be gentle instead of lonely. But even peace can tremble when pride and cruelty enter the room. It happened just after noon. Guests filled the hall with polished shoes and soft laughter. Champagne glasses clinked under the chandelier's light. Liam stood at the far end of the table, his posture composed, his face unreadable as always. He moved through conversation effortlessly, his words confident yet measured. To the guests, he was the same Liam Hawthorne, the impeccable businessman, the man who never let emotion stain his calm. But Sophie noticed the small differences, the way he now smiled when the gardener greeted him, how he thanked the chef, how his eyes softened briefly when they met hers across the room. She never looked long enough to be noticed, but in those seconds something unspoken passed between them, something fragile that only they could feel. The lunch unfolded smoothly until one woman's voice cut through the harmony like a knife. "Excuse me," Mrs. Eleanor Crestmore called out, her tone high, dripping with the kind of arrogance born from too much wealth and too little warmth. She stood, holding up a small piece of white cloth between her fingers. "I believe someone tried to leave this behind." Every sound in the room paused. Forks stopped mid-air, eyes turned toward her. Sophie froze near the sideboard, a tray still in her hands. The cloth fluttered lightly in the air, the handkerchief she had carried since her first day, embroidered with a single crooked flower. Mrs. Crestmore smiled thinly. "It was found under one of the chairs in the guest lounge. I've seen this trick before. A sweet scent, a delicate fabric. A classic attempt to draw attention, wouldn't you say?" Soft laughter rippled across the table. It was cruel, sharp, but disguised behind social politeness. Sophie's throat tightened. The room blurred. She wanted to speak, to say it was a mistake, that she hadn't even been in that room today. But she could feel their eyes, heavy with judgment, and her voice refused to rise. Her fingers trembled around the tray. Margaret, the head housekeeper, stepped forward quickly, taking the cloth from Mrs. Crestmore. "That belongs to Sophie," she said calmly. "She's had it since she arrived. It's an old piece, nothing more." But Mrs. Crestmore only raised a brow. "Of course," she said lightly, the kind of tone that meant she didn't believe a word. Liam stood slowly. His chair scraped softly against the floor. The sound was quiet, but it silenced the room. "Where was it found?" he asked, his voice steady but edged. "Under Mr. Duval's seat," Mrs. Crestmore replied, enjoying the performance. It's nothing, I'm sure, but appearances matter, don't they? Sophie felt her face flush. She could feel every heartbeat echo in her chest. Liam turned his gaze to her then, cool, assessing. The same gaze he had used the day he first watched her through his cameras. It was as if the walls he had started to lower rose again in an instant. "Is it yours?" he asked quietly. Her lips parted, but the words came out barely above a whisper. "Yes." The air tightened around them. "Were you in the guest lounge today?" "No, sir," she said softly, but her voice cracked on the last word. Mrs. Crestmore sighed dramatically, setting her glass down. "It's such a shame. You have such a beautiful home, Mr. Hawthorne, but one must be careful who they trust." The humiliation came not from her words, but from the silence that followed, the quiet doubt that spread through the room like smoke. Sophie could feel it settling on her skin, in her lungs, in the tiny place where pride used to live. She lowered her head, waiting for someone to speak, to stop it. But no one did. Liam's jaw tightened. He looked away, just for a moment, but it was enough. That single hesitation cut deeper than any insult. When the luncheon ended, the hall emptied slowly, leaving behind only the faint scent of perfume and the clatter of dishes being cleared away. Sophie stood in the corridor outside, her hands folded tightly before her apron. She waited because she was told to wait. Liam approached with Margaret beside him, the handkerchief folded neatly in her palm. He stopped a few steps away, his expression unreadable. "Is this yours?" Margaret asked gently, though she already knew the answer. Sophie nodded. "Yes, it must have fallen." Liam's voice came low. "Were you trying to get someone's attention?" The question struck harder than he realized. She looked up at him then, her eyes clear but wounded. "No, sir." "Then why didn't you say anything when she accused you?" She hesitated, her voice trembling as she answered, "Because it wouldn't have mattered." Something inside him faltered. "What do you mean?" She took a deep breath, her words trembling but steady. "I've been accused before. I used to work at a nursing home. There was a patient, Mr. Ellis. He was kind to me. One night he collapsed, and the ambulance took too long, so I gave him my blood. It saved him. But days later, a gold cross went missing. They found it in the laundry cart I used. I didn't take it. I don't even know how it got there." Her voice cracked, the memory raw. "No one believed me. They let me go. Since then, when people accuse me, I don't explain. I just leave." The silence that followed was unbearable. Margaret looked away, tears threatening. Liam stood still, his throat tightening. Her pain reached something deep inside him, something that had forgotten how to feel. She took a slow breath, then whispered, "I'll collect my things." When she turned to go, his voice broke through the air, low but firm. "No." She stopped. He stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking to nothing. "You're not going anywhere." She turned slightly, her eyes wide, shining with disbelief. "I was wrong," he said simply. The words seemed to cost him something. "And I'm sorry." He took the handkerchief from Margaret and pressed it into Sophie's hands. "You don't have to explain anything else, not to me." Her lips trembled, but no words came. For the first time since she arrived at the estate, she allowed herself to cry, not from shame or fear, but from the strange relief of finally being seen. The tears came silently, falling onto the cloth she held so tightly it might have disappeared into her skin. Liam stood there, helpless in the face of her pain. For years he had prided himself on control, but now his heart disobeyed him. He wanted to reach out, to brush away the tears, to tell her she was safe. But he didn't. He simply stayed there, grounded in the quiet understanding between them. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "Thank you." He nodded once, his own voice rough. "Go rest, please." She turned away, walking down the corridor, the sunlight catching in her hair like threads of gold. When she disappeared around the corner, Liam exhaled shakily, running a hand through his hair. His chest ached, not from guilt alone, but from the realization that he had almost destroyed something pure. That night, the mansion was silent again. But it wasn't the heavy silence of suspicion anymore. It was fragile, tender, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Liam sat by the window of his study, looking out at the garden below. The same garden where his mother once grew roses. He thought of Sophie's words, of how easy it was to break someone who only ever wanted peace. He whispered to the night, "Not again." Outside, the stars glowed faintly above the ivy walls, and for the first time Liam prayed, not to undo what had happened, but to learn how to be the kind of man who didn't need to test love to believe in it. Down the hall, Sophie lay awake, her tears dried, her heart heavy but oddly calm. There was something healing in his apology, not perfect but real. She closed her eyes, breathing in the faint scent of lavender from her own hair, and for the first time in years she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, not everyone would walk away. And somewhere in the quiet between them, two broken hearts began to mend in silence, bound not by words, but by the shared ache of being misunderstood, and the fragile, beautiful desire to be kind again. Morning would come soon, bringing new light and gentler beginnings. But for now, in the soft stillness of night, forgiveness lived quietly between them, like a small flame refusing to go out. The morning after the storm of words and accusations, the Hawthorne estate was wrapped in an unfamiliar kind of stillness, one that wasn't heavy with judgment, but softened by remorse. Sunlight broke through the curtains like a quiet apology from the sky. The garden glistened with dew, and the roses his mother once planted shimmered in shades of forgiveness. Inside, the air held the kind of peace that only comes after pain, fragile, new, trembling like a heartbeat learning to steady itself again. Liam stood by the large window of his study, watching the light crawl slowly across the marble floor. He hadn't slept much. The echo of Sophie's voice still haunted him. The way she had said because it wouldn't have mattered with such aching calm. Those words had struck deeper than he'd expected, revealing not just her wounds, but his own reflection in them. He had built his world around control, suspicion, and proof. But her story, her quiet suffering, had shown him something he didn't know how to face: the cost of doubt. He left the study and walked down the corridor toward the service wing. The house was alive with gentle sounds, porcelain clinking, water running, faint footsteps on polished floors. When he reached the back hallway, he found her there, arranging cleaning supplies on the shelf. Her sleeves were rolled to her elbows, her hair loosely tied back. She moved with focus, unaware that someone was watching her. For a moment, he said nothing. He just watched, the delicate precision of her hands, the way her brow furrowed slightly when she read the small handwritten labels. There was a purity in her movements, an honesty that words could never match. "Sophie," he said softly. She turned, startled, her eyes wide for a second before she composed herself. "Mr. Hawthorne," she murmured, wiping her hands on her apron. "Would you walk with me for a moment?" Her first instinct was hesitation, but something in his voice, gentle, unfamiliar, almost human, made her nod. They walked side by side through the corridor, past the courtyard, until they reached a small wooden gate at the far edge of the garden. The hinges creaked faintly as he pushed it open. Beyond it lay a forgotten corner of the estate, untouched, overgrown with ivy and wild roses. The air was different there, softer, smelling of earth and memory. "This was my mother's garden," he said quietly, his eyes tracing the vines that had reclaimed the trellises. "No one's been here in years." Sophie glanced around, unsure why he had brought her. The place felt sacred, like stepping into someone's old prayer. "She used to call it her sanctuary," he continued. "When she passed, I locked it. I told myself it was to preserve it, but really I just couldn't face what it meant to lose the only person who believed in me without reason." He paused, his voice low, steady. "You reminded me of her." Sophie blinked, surprised. How?" "Because she saw goodness where others didn't. Because she believed quiet hearts often hold the loudest truths." He looked at her then, the distance between them closing like a slow exhale. "And because she would have liked you." She lowered her gaze, her voice barely a whisper. "You don't have to say that." "I'm not saying it to be kind," he said simply. "I'm saying it because it's true." They stood in silence, the wind threading softly through the overgrown vines. Somewhere a bird sang, a small, hopeful sound that broke the still air. "I owe you an apology," Liam said finally, "for doubting you, for thinking goodness needed proof, for almost pushing you away when all you ever offered was honesty." She shook her head gently. "You don't have to—" He interrupted, but his tone was soft. "Yes, I do. Because for the first time I see it now. I used to believe that good people defended themselves, that truth always spoke loud enough to be heard. But you've shown me something else. Sometimes the kindest souls stay silent, not because they're weak, but because they've been hurt enough to know words rarely change hearts." Her eyes lifted to his, the emotion in them quiet but deep. "Silence can be safer," she said softly. "And yet you still stayed," he whispered, "even when silence could have meant losing everything." The air between them shifted, heavy with something unspoken but alive. The sunlight spilled gently through the canopy of leaves, catching the dust in the air like small floating stars. Sophie looked around the forgotten garden, the cracked stones, the tangled roses, the life that had persisted even in neglect. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "It used to feel like hers," he said. "But today, it feels like yours too." She froze for a moment, uncertain how to respond. But she could see it in his eyes, the sincerity that had taken root there, fragile but real. It wasn't flattery. It was gratitude. It was peace rediscovering itself in a man who had spent too long in the dark. They walked in silence for a while, following the small stone path. The ivy brushed against her skirt, the scent of jasmine rising from the soil. Liam's steps were slow, unhurried, as though he feared the moment might vanish if he moved too quickly. When they reached the center of the garden, he stopped beside an old fountain. The water no longer flowed, but the basin was filled with rainwater and fallen petals. He crouched down, brushing a few leaves away. "I used to come here as a boy," he said. "My mother told me every rose in this garden had a story, each one planted for someone she loved." He looked up at Sophie. "Maybe it's time to plant another." Her heart fluttered. "For whom?" He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried warmth rather than charm. "For whoever reminds us that kindness still exists." She watched as he dug into the soil with his bare hands, his white shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows. It was the first time she had seen him look ordinary. No suit, no control, just a man reconnecting with something tender inside himself. The sight made her chest ache in a way that wasn't painful, but healing. "Would you help me?" he asked quietly. She knelt beside him, their hands brushing briefly as they pressed the roots of a small lavender plant into the earth. The touch was fleeting, yet enough to send a soft warmth through her skin. When the plant was set, they both sat back, their shoulders nearly touching. "Lavender," she said with a small smile. "Good choice." "My mother's favorite," he murmured. "She said it keeps the heart calm." They stayed like that for a while, the sound of rustling leaves filling the silence. Sophie closed her eyes briefly, letting the sunlight touch her face. For the first time since she'd been accused, she could breathe fully again. The garden, once forgotten, felt alive. It was as if the place itself was healing through them. Liam watched her from the corner of his eye. There was something about the way she existed in silence, how she didn't need to speak to fill the air. She carried peace with her like a scent, like a promise. He wondered how long it had been since he'd felt such quiet clarity. When she opened her eyes, she caught him looking. Neither of them looked away this time. "You shouldn't be out here without gloves," she said softly, her voice trembling just enough to betray the stir in her heart. He smiled faintly. "I think a little dirt is good for me." She laughed, a small, pure sound that melted through the garden like light through glass. And in that laugh, he found something he hadn't realized he'd been searching for. Joy that asked for nothing in return. As the afternoon faded into golden dusk, they stood to leave. Before she stepped through the gate, she turned back once more, her eyes resting on the lavender plant. "It'll grow stronger if someone takes care of it," she said. He nodded. "I will." Her gaze lingered on him for a heartbeat longer than it should have. Then she walked away, her figure dissolving into the warm light. Liam remained standing in the quiet garden long after she was gone. The air smelled of earth and lavender. He ran his thumb over the soil, feeling the pulse of life beneath it. Something in him had changed. The walls he'd spent years building no longer felt like protection. They felt like absence. That night, as he sat in his mother's old chair, he could still feel the ghost of her presence in the room, the same peace he had felt beside Sophie in the garden. It was as if both women had reached across time to teach him the same truth, that love doesn't announce itself through grand gestures. It lives in small acts of care, in quiet forgiveness, in the willingness to stay even when the world has turned its back. When he closed his eyes, he saw her smile again, the one she'd given him as she walked away. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to guard his heart against it. He simply let it fill the empty spaces, warm and gentle, like sunlight soaking into cold stone. Somewhere beyond the garden walls, Sophie was lying awake too, thinking of the way he had knelt beside her, the sincerity in his apology, the soil under their fingers. She pressed her hand against her heart and whispered a small prayer, not for herself, but for him. May he learn to trust softness again. And in that quiet wish, two hearts began to beat in rhythm, no longer strangers, no longer afraid, just two souls finding their way toward the same gentle light, step by step, breath by breath, healing as they went. The rain began without warning, soft at first, then heavy enough to blur the night into a curtain of silver. The sky rumbled gently over the hawthorn estate, thunder rolling like a deep breath between heartbeats. Lights flickered once, twice, then went out entirely, leaving only the dim glow of the emergency fixtures along the hallways. The house, so often defined by its stillness, now pulsed with the soft rhythm of the storm. Liam stood by his office window, watching water slide down the glass. The lavender plant they had planted that morning still stood upright in the garden below, its purple petals trembling under the weight of rain. He thought about how easily something so small could endure so much and still remain beautiful. A quiet warmth spread through his chest, but it was fragile, like light held in a trembling hand. The generator hummed faintly in the background, but the rest of the house was dark. He left the office, walking through the hallway with a flashlight in hand. His footsteps echoed against the marble, slow and steady. Every sound felt louder in the quiet. His own breathing, the low whisper of rain against the windows, the occasional crack of thunder rolling in the distance. When he turned the corner near the kitchen, he caught sight of a faint movement. A small figure stood by the open window, her dress clinging to her like a second skin. Sophie was there, pressing a dish towel against the cracked glass as rain poured in through the gap. Water soaked the counter, the floor, her hair. She worked quickly, quietly, her shoulders trembling from the cold, her hands red from the chill. "Sophie!" he called gently, his voice barely above the sound of the rain. She looked up, startled, her eyes wide. "I'm sorry, sir. The wind broke the latch, and the rain—" He shook his head. "It's all right." Before she could say anything more, he shrugged off his jacket and stepped toward her. The air around them was cold and damp. Without a word, he draped the jacket over her shoulders. It was still warm from his body, and the fabric swallowed her small frame. Her breath caught as she looked up at him. "You'll get sick," he said softly. "I'm fine," she whispered, though her voice shivered as much as her hands. He didn't argue. Instead, he guided her away from the window, his hand hovering near her back, careful not to startle her. The hallway lights flickered again as thunder rolled overhead. He led her into the smaller emergency kitchen, one of the few rooms still glowing with amber light. The space was narrow and cluttered but dry, filled with the comforting scent of bread and tea leaves. She stood near the counter, clutching the edges of his jacket around herself. Drops of rain traced down her neck, glimmering under the soft light. Liam moved quietly, filling a kettle, finding two mismatched mugs. He didn't ask if she wanted tea. He simply made it, because it gave his hands something to do besides reach for her. When the water began to boil, he turned and leaned against the counter opposite her. The rain continued to beat against the windows, but inside it felt strangely peaceful. "You shouldn't have stayed by that window," he said gently. Her eyes flicked to his. "I couldn't just leave it. The water was getting in." "You could have called someone." She smiled faintly. "I didn't want to wake anyone." He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head, but the corners of his lips softened. "You don't have to fix everything alone." Sophie looked down at her hands, fingers tracing the rim of the counter. "I'm used to it." The words came out small, almost lost beneath the hum of rain. He studied her quietly, his heart tightening at how familiar that sounded, how much it echoed his own life. He crossed the room and set one of the mugs in front of her. Steam curled between them, warm and fragrant. She wrapped her fingers around it immediately, her shoulders relaxing as the heat seeped into her skin. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, his gaze lingering on the way her lips curved slightly when she spoke. The silence that settled between them wasn't uncomfortable this time. It was full of something tender, almost sacred. He took a slow sip of tea before asking, "Why did you stay, Sophie?" She blinked, unsure if she heard him right. "After everything," he said softly. "The accusations, the doubt. You could have left. Most people would have." She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Then she lowered her gaze. "Because no one has needed me like this place does," she said quietly. "And because I didn't want to leave while someone who's still hurting pretends he isn't." His heart stopped for a moment. The simplicity of her words broke through him like light through fog. She wasn't accusing him, wasn't pitying him, just seeing him in a way no one ever had. He looked away, his throat tightening. "You think I'm pretending?" She didn't answer right away. "I think sometimes people forget that strength doesn't mean never hurting. It just means you keep showing up, even when it hurts." Liam's hand clenched around his cup. Her voice was calm, steady, but every word felt like a mirror held up to the parts of him he'd buried. He wanted to tell her that she was wrong, that he didn't need saving, but he couldn't, because for the first time he realized she wasn't trying to save him at all. She was simply there. "I don't know how to be soft with people," he admitted quietly. "I never learned how." She took a small step closer, her voice barely a whisper. "You don't have to know. You just have to feel it." He turned toward her, his gaze meeting hers. The light from the small bulb above flickered softly, painting her face in hues of gold and shadow. Her eyes were warm and patient, her presence calm, unafraid. Something in him finally broke loose, the last piece of distance he'd been holding on to. He reached out, hesitating for a heartbeat before brushing a strand of damp hair from her cheek. His fingertips lingered against her skin, tracing the warmth there, the life. She didn't flinch. She just looked up at him, steady and open, as if she'd been waiting for this moment without expecting it. It wasn't a kiss, wasn't a confession, just a touch, simple and human, but it carried the weight of everything he'd been too afraid to feel. Her eyes softened. "You don't always have to be in control," she whispered. He let out a quiet breath that felt like surrender. "You make it sound easy." "It isn't," she said gently, "but it's worth it." They stood like that for a while, The rain outside softening into a calmer rhythm. The world had shrunk to this small kitchen, to the steam rising from forgotten cups, to the fragile distance between their hearts. He finally stepped back, not because he wanted to, but because he had to breathe. Sophie turned away slightly, her cheeks flushed, her hands trembling just enough to betray what she felt. The silence between them was full, heavy with emotion, yet soothing, like a lullaby that never needed words. After a long pause, she whispered, "You should rest, sir." He smiled faintly. "Liam," he said softly. "My name is Liam." She looked up, startled by the gentleness in his tone. "Good night, Liam," she whispered, and the way she said it made his name sound like a prayer. He watched her leave the room, her figure swallowed by the soft glow of the hallway light. The scent of lavender and tea lingered in her wake, mingling with the distant hum of the storm. When she was gone, he leaned back against the counter, closing his eyes. The warmth of her touch still lived on his skin. Outside, the rain slowed to a drizzle, tapping gently against the windows like fingertips. The sound wasn't lonely anymore. It was soothing, rhythmic, alive. For the first time in years, Liam didn't feel like a man watching his life from behind glass. He felt present, real, alive. And beneath all of it, a fragile hope began to take root, a quiet belief that maybe after all his mistakes, he still had the chance to become someone better. He glanced toward the window. The garden was glistening under the pale light of the moon. The lavender plant swayed gently, unbroken. That night, long after Sophie had gone to her room, Liam sat in the kitchen, finishing the tea she hadn't touched. It was cold now, but he didn't mind. The silence felt different, warmer, softer. He let it wrap around him like her quiet kindness, like the faint echo of her voice saying his name. And as the storm finally passed, something inside him healed, unseen but real, like the way morning comes not with noise, but with light. Morning returned with soft grace, washing the hawthorn estate in shades of gold and pale blue. The air carried the scent of wet soil and lavender, gentle reminders of the storm that had passed. The world felt lighter somehow, renewed, as though the rain had rinsed away not just dust, but the remnants of sorrow that clung to the walls. Sophie moved quietly through the corridors, her footsteps soft against the marble floors. She carried a small basket of clean linens, her braids still damp from the early morning air. Though her face was calm, her heart felt different now, full in a way that frightened her, warmed by a moment she couldn't stop replaying in her mind. She remembered the weight of his jacket, the warmth of his hands, the quiet steadiness of his eyes when he said her name. Liam. The sound of it still lingered in her, fragile but alive, as if speaking it again might unravel her restraint. When she entered the drawing-room, she found him already there, standing by the window with his sleeves rolled up, sunlight spilling across his shoulders. He was reading something, a stack of invitations, she realized. But his attention seemed far away. The light caught on the edges of his hair, and for a second he didn't look like the man she had first met. He looked younger, almost peaceful. He turned when he sensed her presence. "Good morning." She hesitated. "Good morning, Mr. Hawthorne." "Liam," he corrected gently, his voice low but kind. Her lips curved softly. "Good morning, Liam." Something about the way she said it made his chest tighten. The sound of his name on her tongue was both soothing and dangerous. He motioned for her to come closer, and she set the basket on the table, arranging the linens carefully, though her hands trembled slightly. "There's an event tonight," he said. "A charity gala. It's for the foundation my mother started before she passed. We're hosting it here." Sophie nodded, listening. "I'd like you to help oversee it," he added, watching her reaction. "The seating, the flow, the details. You see things others miss." Her head lifted sharply. "Me? I trust your judgment." The words were simple, but they carried a quiet power. She blinked, unsure how to respond. Thank you. I'll do my best." "I know you will," he said, and turned back to the window. But behind his calm tone, something deeper stirred, something that had begun to take root since the night of the storm. He didn't just trust her work. He trusted her with something more fragile, the parts of himself he used to guard. As the day unfolded, the house transformed. Staff moved through the rooms, arranging flowers, polishing glass, unfolding tablecloths that shimmered like silk. Sophie worked tirelessly, but without restlessness, her mind focused, her heart steady. She coordinated the staff, corrected small mistakes with patience, and brought a sense of calm to the chaos that usually filled such preparations. Liam watched her from afar more than once, quietly admiring the ease with which she carried responsibility. By evening, the estate glowed beneath strings of warm lights that danced along the hedges and fountains. Guests arrived in tailored suits and glittering gowns, laughter spilling into the night air. The hum of conversation blended with the gentle notes of the string quartet by the garden's fountain. It was everything wealth could buy: elegance, beauty, refinement. But beneath it all there was something more subtle. For the first time in years, the house felt alive in a way that couldn't be designed. It felt like it had a soul again. Sophie moved among the guests with quiet grace, her pale blue dress modest yet luminous under the lights. It wasn't new. It had once belonged to Margaret's daughter. But on her, it looked timeless. She greeted each person with a warm nod, guiding them through the evening, ensuring everything ran seamlessly. Her composure was serene, her eyes gentle, but inside her heart beat faster each time she caught sight of Liam across the room. He stood near the center of the ballroom, surrounded by people who admired him, yet his gaze often drifted, searching for her. When their eyes met across the crowd, he felt the noise fade, replaced by the quiet truth neither of them could speak aloud. Later in the evening, a member of the board tapped his glass, drawing the room's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced with a smile, "Mr. Liam Hawthorne would like to say a few words." Applause followed. Liam stepped forward, adjusting the microphone. His reflection gleamed faintly in the polished silver beside him. The man who had once built a fortress around himself now stood before a room filled with faces, and one pair of eyes that made him feel both grounded and exposed. He began softly, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "I've hosted many events like this," he said, "and I've spoken about numbers, buildings, projects, things that can be built and measured. But tonight, I want to talk about something that can't be counted." The room grew still. "There was a time I believed kindness was a weakness," he continued, "that trust had to be earned through proof, not grace. I spent years testing people, waiting for them to fail, until one day someone proved that the truest kind of strength is quiet, gentle, unseen." Sophie froze near the back of the room, her hand gripping the edge of her clipboard. She knew he was speaking to her, even if no one else did. Liam's gaze drifted across the guests before settling, just for a heartbeat, on her. "There's someone among us tonight," he said softly, "who reminded me that goodness doesn't announce itself. It lives in small acts, in the way we treat others when no one is watching. This person reminded me that light can exist even in a place long forgotten by warmth." His voice faltered slightly, but he smiled through it. "I won't name her," he said gently, "because she doesn't need her name spoken to matter. She's already made this house, and my life, a better place." The applause began slowly, then grew louder, filling the ballroom. Sophie's chest ached with a strange, beautiful pain. Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them away, smiling faintly through the trembling in her heart. When the speech ended, Liam stepped off the stage and made his way toward her. The crowd parted subtly as he approached, carrying something small in his hand, a velvet box. He stopped in front of her, his eyes soft but sure. "This belongs to someone who keeps light in her heart," he said quietly. She opened the box, her fingers trembling. Inside was a delicate silver pendant shaped like a star. Its surface gleamed like the night sky reflected in water. She recognized it instantly. It had belonged to his mother. She had seen it in the portrait that hung in the main hall. "My mother used to wear this," he said softly. "She told me once that people who carry light inside them will always find their way. You've done that, Sophie, even when no one was watching." Her breath caught, the world spinning gently around her. She wanted to speak, to tell him how much his words meant, but her voice refused to come. Instead, her eyes said everything: gratitude, affection, the fragile beginning of something she didn't dare name. He fastened the chain around her neck himself, his hands brushing lightly against her skin. The warmth of his touch lingered even after he stepped back. "Thank you," she whispered at last, her voice trembling. He smiled faintly. "No, Sophie, thank you." The music resumed, soft and tender. Conversations flowed again, but for the two of them, the world had shifted. Something unspoken had bloomed fully between them, fragile but certain, like lavender pushing through cracked stone. As the night deepened, guests began to leave, their laughter fading into the distance. The lights dimmed until only the candles on the tables remained, flickering softly like the last whispers of the evening. Sophie stood by the doorway, watching the last car disappear through the gates. Liam joined her, his hands in his pockets, his voice quiet. "You made tonight perfect," he said. She turned toward him, her heart full. "It wasn't me. It was everyone." He shook his head slightly. "It was you." For a moment, neither spoke. The world around them had gone still again, but this silence was warm, alive. She looked up at him, the star pendant glinting against her collarbone. He reached out, his fingers barely brushing the chain. "It suits you," he murmured. She smiled softly. "Your mother had good taste." "She had good instincts," he said, eyes meeting hers. "Just like you." Their gazes lingered, long and unguarded. The night air smelled of roses and rain. The candlelight caught in her eyes, and he thought, for the first time, that maybe love wasn't something grand or sudden. It was this, a quiet unfolding, a truth that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to be seen. Neither of them moved, but everything between them shifted. The distance that had once felt safe now felt unbearable. He wanted to tell her what she had become to him, that she was the calm after every storm, the proof that gentleness could heal. But the words would have broken the spell. So instead, he simply whispered her name like it was a promise. Sophie. She looked at him, and in her eyes he saw it too, the same tender ache, the same trembling joy of something real taking shape. Outside, the stars stretched endless across the sky, each one flickering like a heartbeat. Inside, beneath the glow of fading light, two hearts stood on the edge of something neither of them could yet define, but both had already chosen. And in that fragile stillness, love took its first full breath, quiet, real, and healing. The morning after the gala was quiet, bathed in the kind of golden light that feels like forgiveness. The Hawthorne estate, which only hours before had been filled with laughter and music, now stood calm again, its halls carrying a softer echo, like a sigh after joy. Sophie woke earlier than usual, though her body longed to rest. She sat by her small window, watching the garden slowly come alive beneath the tender touch of dawn. The lavender they had planted together stood proud among the dew, its fragrance drifting upward with the wind. She smiled faintly, her fingers tracing the silver star that now hung around her neck. It was strange, she thought, how something so small could feel like both a weight and a promise. Every time she touched it, she remembered his words. Those who keep light in their hearts will always find their way. She wanted to believe that. And for the first time in a long time, she did. Downstairs, Liam stood in the kitchen, brewing tea the way he had seen her do so many times before. He still wasn't good at it, the water never quite the right temperature, the sugar always a little too much, but it gave him peace. The morning sunlight touched his face, softening the lines of worry that once seemed carved into him. He didn't look like the man who tested people anymore. He looked like someone learning, quietly, to trust. When Sophie entered, her steps light as always, he turned and smiled, not the polite smile he gave to investors or guests, but something gentler. "Good morning," he said softly. "Good morning," she replied, her voice as warm as the light filling the room. He handed her a cup, awkward but sincere. "I tried not to burn it this time." She laughed, a soft sound that wrapped around the moment like sunlight. "I'll take my chances." She took a sip and nodded. "Better." He leaned against the counter, watching her. "You make this house feel different," he said after a pause. She looked up. "Different?" "Alive," he said simply. Her heart caught in her chest, but she said nothing. Some things didn't need words. The days that followed were gentle ones. Quiet mornings shared over tea, afternoons spent tending to the garden, small exchanges of glances and laughter that carried more meaning than any declaration could. Their lives began to fall into rhythm, one that felt less like routine and more like peace rediscovered. But healing rarely comes without change. And love, when true, does not cage. It sets free. One morning, a letter arrived. It was addressed to Sophie, written in elegant cursive. She hesitated before opening it, her fingers trembling slightly. The seal bore the emblem of the Hawthorne Health Foundation. Inside was a single sheet of paper, its words neat and formal. Her eyes widened as she read, "Congratulations. You have been awarded a full nursing scholarship through the Hawthorne Health Foundation." She read it again, certain she must have misunderstood. Full tuition, housing, and a small stipend. It was more than she had ever dared to hope for. At the bottom, in handwriting that made her heart still, were the words, "Someone believed in you. Now go become who you were meant to be." She closed the letter slowly, her vision blurring with quiet tears. She didn't need a signature. She already knew. Later that morning, she found Liam in his study. He was at his desk, pretending to read a report, though his eyes were far away. She stood at the doorway for a long moment, her voice steady but soft. "I got your letter." He didn't look up, only smiled faintly. "Then you know. You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to." His voice was calm, but his hands had stilled on the papers. "You once said this house needed you. You were right. But maybe the world does too." She walked closer, the silver pendant glinting against her chest. "And what about you?" she asked quietly. He looked at her then, his eyes full of everything he couldn't put into words. "I'll be fine," he said, "as long as I know you're out there doing what you're meant to do." She wanted to tell him that leaving would break her heart, that every corner of this house had become home because he was in it. But she also knew that love wasn't about holding someone close. It was about giving them space to grow. So she just nodded, her smile trembling but sincere. "I'll make you proud." "You already have." The following weeks passed like a slow exhale. They didn't talk about the goodbye that was coming. They simply lived in the quiet spaces between, each day a soft echo of something sacred. Then came the morning she left. Her suitcase was small. She never had much, but her heart felt heavy with all she was carrying. Liam met her by the front gate, the garden blooming behind them. The air was filled with the scent of rain and lavender. "I'll send updates," she said, her smile brave though her eyes shimmered. "You don't have to," he said gently. "Just live well. That'll be enough." She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. When she turned to go, he stopped her with a quiet voice. "Sophie." She turned. He stepped closer, his hand finding hers. "If one day you ever want to come back," he said softly, "the house will still be here. So will I." Tears welled in her eyes, but she smiled through them. "I'll remember." And then she was gone, walking down the long driveway until she disappeared beyond the gates, leaving behind the man who had once built walls and now waited with open hands. Time passed. Seasons changed. 6 months later, autumn returned to the Hawthorne estate, painting the world in shades of amber and gold. Liam spent his mornings in the garden now, kneeling among the lavender plants. He tended to them with patient care, his fingers stained with earth, his mind quieter than it had ever been. The house no longer felt lonely. It felt like memory and peace woven together. He didn't expect her to return. Some loves, he thought, live not in presence, but in the spaces they leave behind. But one crisp afternoon, as the sun began to sink, he heard footsteps behind him, a sound he had memorized long ago. He turned slowly. She stood there at the gate, her hair longer, her face gentler, her smile the same. "Still can't keep those lines straight," she teased softly, glancing at the uneven rows of lavender. He froze, disbelief and joy colliding inside him. "You're here." "I thought I'd visit the lavender," she said, eyes shimmering. "And the man who planted it." He swallowed hard, his voice low. "I didn't know if you'd come back." "I didn't either," she admitted. "But something kept calling me home." She handed him a small box wrapped in white paper. He opened it carefully. Inside was a new handkerchief, embroidered neatly in gold thread. Along the corner were two names, Liam and Sophie. He stared at it for a long moment, then looked up, smiling faintly. "So, this time you meant to leave it behind?" She shook her head gently. "No," she whispered. "This time, I want you to keep it." He stepped closer, the air between them thick with all the words they'd never said. When his hand found hers, it felt like no time had passed at all, like two parts of the same song finally finding their rhythm again. Later that evening, they were in the kitchen together, laughter mingling with the soft clatter of dishes. Sophie sat on the counter, swinging her feet as Liam washed the plates. The twilight light fell through the windows, painting everything in soft amber. "I never thought I'd see you doing dishes," she teased. He grinned over his shoulder. "Don't tell anyone. It'll ruin my reputation." Their laughter filled the room, warm and free, echoing softly off the walls that once knew only silence. When he finished, he leaned beside her, their shoulders brushing lightly. Outside, the last light of day faded into dusk, and the scent of lavender drifted through the open window. For a while they didn't speak. They just watched the world quiet down, breathing in the peace they had both searched for so long. Liam turned toward her, his voice a whisper. "You were right, you know, about healing." Sophie smiled softly. "It takes time." "And the right person," he added. Their eyes met, and in that gaze lived everything they had been, every storm, every silence, every moment that had led them here. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was simple, steady, beautiful. The kind of love that doesn't demand to be seen, only felt. And as the first stars appeared outside the window, they stayed there, two souls finally at peace, wrapped in the quiet warmth of a home that had found its heart again. If this story touched something gentle in your heart, leave a light behind for it. Write a word, a thought, or even silence in the comments below. Let it be a reminder that kindness still matters, that healing is real, and that love in its truest form always finds its way home. Like, share, or subscribe, not for the numbers, but for the light it keeps alive. May your days be soft, your nights peaceful, and your heart always brave enough to choose love again.